Yesterday marked 1 year since George Floyd was murdered by former white police officer Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis, Minnesota. From calls for police reform to music, movies, and canceled podcasts to toppled monuments, in part two of our series on race, reflections, and remembrance, we are looking at the culture we shared in the year after Floyd's murder. And we are asking, where do we go from here? All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report.
On May 25th, 2020, George Floyd was murdered under the knee of white police officer Derek Chauvin. After months of protest and cries for police reform, many Americans remain divided over what reform, if any, is necessary. Efforts to enact a federal police reform bill has stalled in the Senate despite President Biden's repeated request to have the bill passed by the anniversary of George Floyd's death. Cities like Minneapolis are walking back commitments to reduce its police budget in the wake of rising violent crimes. And from Black Judas and the Black Messiah to hers, I can't breathe. No doubt, George Floyd's death, his murder, changed this country. But is this change the change that activists marched and hoped for? Here for my leadoff panel is part two of my interview with Black Lives Matter Los Angeles co-founder and professor of Pan-African Studies at Cal State LA, Dr. Melina Abdullah. Thank you so much, Dr. Abdullah, for coming back on our two-part series. You know, we've been talking about the anniversary of George Floyd's death and what it means in terms of police reform, racial reckoning. And today we want to really focus on where do we go from here? Since George Floyd's murder, I want to just read you a couple of things that have happened. And then get your reaction to them. We've passed police reform laws in more than 30 states. 16 states have limited or banned use of neck restraints. 10 states have required funding for body cams. 6 states have restricted the use of no-knock warrants like the one that led to the murder of Breonna Taylor. And we know several states have passed laws requiring officers to intervene when they see fellow officers using excessive force. And now 4 states have also suspended or ended qualified immunity for police who abuse their power and result in injuries to civilians. So I want to ask you, when you look at all of those things that have happened, and all of this has happened in the last year since George Floyd's murder, do you say this is enough? Or would you say this is enough?
No, it's nowhere near enough. It's nowhere near enough. So what we know is that there's been some tinkering around the edges of a fundamentally unjust system of policing. And I was fortunate enough last week to be with the family of George Floyd, and, you know, his brothers and nephew and others really agree that we have to move beyond the language and practice of reform to talk about and move towards the transformation of the public safety system in this country. We have to remember that many states already banned chokeholds. Many states already used body cams. When we think about counties like Los Angeles and cities like Los Angeles, we already have body cams. We already have these things, and it doesn't stop the police from killing our people. If we look at every major study, there's only 2 things that limit the violence that Black people experience at the hands of police. The first is accountability. That means there are far too many officers who are able to not just kill us, but kill us with impunity, that there are no repercussions, that they are not fired and prosecuted. We can think about the murder of Black father Anthony McLean in Pasadena, California, who was shot, and that officer is still on the force. We can think about the officers who murdered Waukesha Wilson, who murdered Riddell Jones, who murdered 14-year-old Jesse Romero, and that they they are not fired and they are definitely not prosecuted. The second thing, though, that helps to protect Black people, especially against police violence, is removing police from interactions. And I know that sounds like a lot to say, but it's why defund the police became the clarion call of the last year. Defund the police means take money away from policing units that brutalize and kill our people and invest those dollars in things that actually make communities safe. And we know cities like Newark, New Jersey, where Mayor Raz Baraka has committed to funding intervention work, you've actually seen crime rates drop, even as the rest of the country has seen a growth in crime rates. We know what actually creates safe communities is when we have housing, when we have health care, when we have mental health resources, when there are jobs that are provide enough resource to care for your families. And so the two things, again, that we need are accountability, and we also need the defunding of the police and reimagining public safety and investing in those reimaginings.
So I'm glad you mentioned, Dr. Abdullah, that you were with George Floyd's family and that you've been talking to the families, because I often wonder, as policy is being created, if residents, people who've been impacted, are at the table enough. Because what we saw in Minneapolis, after George Floyd's murder, there was this call by the city council to defund the Minneapolis Police Department. And then later there was a lawsuit filed by residents in that city saying, no, we want our police department essentially restored. And talking to some of the activists, what I heard them say was, or what they told me, is that people that live in Black communities in Minneapolis were not at the table. And so they made the decision about defunding without people who are impacted being at the table. So when you think about moving forward and you give us this study, you say these are the two things that work, what do you see as the greatest impediment to getting to where you think, where these studies and where activists like you say we should be? Because we have residents in Minneapolis saying, oh, no, we don't want you to defund our police, and you didn't have us at the table, so we're going to sue you and take you to court to litigate this matter. And you say, here's this study that shows us what does decrease police violence. So, how do we bring those two together and get them in the same room and get people talking?
Sure. So one, we have to remember that activists and organizers are also residents, right? So Black Lives Matter doesn't pay me. I'm an educator. I have a completely different job. I'm a mother who lives in the Crenshaw district of Los Angeles. And so I'm at the table as not just an organizer with Black Lives Matter, but as a mother who's trying to raise 3 Black children and raise them in a way that we live in a world where they can walk to and from the bus stop, to and from 7-Eleven safely, right? So it's important that we remember that organizers are members of our communities who have heeded what I call our sacred duty to rise up, right? We also have to remember that our opposition, the ones who say, no, don't defund the police, many of them are really kind of manipulated by the very narrow interests of police associations. And so who's on the other side?
Hold on a second, Dr. Abdullah. When you say that, are you talking about like the Black citizens in Minneapolis that were a part of that lawsuit? Would you say they were manipulated by unions?
I would say that it's important to remember that as sheriffs like the one we live under, Villanueva, #Victims Matter, that victims or survivors, as my brother Akila Sherrills would call them, prime survivors, right. Are looking for justice, and they're working to make sure that the lives of their loved ones mean something. And they don't always know who to turn to, partially because we haven't invested as heavily in groups like the Reverence Project, like Americans for Safety and Justice, as we should. And so when police interests come and say, look, when they say defund the police, they're talking about unsafety for your community. that because we don't have the same tens of millions and sometimes in big cities like Los Angeles, billions of dollars to go and do a PR campaign, that they are listening to these community safety officers who say, you know, you don't want crime on the streets. You want me here, right? Okay. And so it's important that we remember that the police lobby is huge and they use many, many tactics. Just a couple days ago, we watched as the police lobby rallied a bunch of rappers, including a rapper who had a hit song called 187 on an Undercover Cop, right? Rallied them to stand with the sheriffs. And so they have the resources, they have the capacity to make sure that they pull some folks over to their side. What we know also as we talk about academic studies is that studies like the one that came out of Loyola Marymount University, studies like the People's Budget Study, right? Studies like some of the work that's coming out of schools like Fordham, right, are saying that the majority of people actually still believe that we should defund the police. Here's the last point I want to make on that, right, is that when you say who is our opposition is absolutely the police lobby and police associations that, again, are pushing for the very narrow interests of their members. Yeah. But here's the other piece, that we never said defund the police by itself. Yeah. We said defund the police and reimagine public safety. And what we know is that in cities around the country where we've been successful in getting them to defund the police, the dollars that were saved were not reinvested in the community. Right. And so
a chance for it to really take hold to see what the outcome would be if we had that investment. Hey, I'm running out of time, but real quickly, if you were able to wave a magic wand and be queen for the day, what would happen this summer as it relates to protests, as it relates to this, national conversation on, racial reckoning that's happening? What would you like to see this summer look like?
I would love to see people stay in these streets. As we say the name George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and here in Los Angeles, Dejan Kazee and Fred Williams and Anthony McClain and Riddell Jones, it's important that we not just say names, but we do the work. And so this summer, we want to keep people in the streets. We also want people to hold their elected officials accountable, hold them accountable. In Los Angeles, they've said $250 million reinvested in Black communities. Our community ain't seen not one of those dollars, right?
Well, so I gotta wrap you, Dr. Abdullah, because I'm running out of time, and this is such a big and important conversation. And I'm so glad you told us this summer, stay in the streets, stay on it, and hold our elected officials accountable.
Absolutely.
That's a great place for us in this conversation. Of course, I got to have you back because there's so much more to talk about. Yeah. And you are just a wealth of information and inspiration, more importantly. So again, thank you so much for joining me this morning. And I always look forward to having you with me. All right. Well, I want to thank again Dr. Melina Abdullah. She has been on the streets for months and even years fighting for social justice issues. And as you heard her say, she's a mother of 3 and she happens to be a single mother. So I give her so much props and credit for the work that she's doing in Los Angeles that's really reverberating all over this country. My next guest I want to bring on is Nakima Levy-Armstrong. She's also a civil rights attorney like me. She's an executive director of Wayfinder Foundation. She's the former president of Minneapolis NAACP, and she has been on the streets in Minneapolis in the way that Dr. Abdullah has been in Los Angeles. Welcome back to the show, Nakima.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely. Always good to see you, my friend. So here we are, a year after the murder of George Floyd. And you heard Dr. Abdullah say that, in her opinion, the biggest opposition to change is the police lobby and police association. Do you agree with that assessment?
So let me just first say that I've known Dr. Abdullah for a very long time. We went to USC together. And we have these conversations pretty often. But I think in addition to the points that she raised, there is an aspect that's more nuanced when it comes to the Black community. So if you look at what has happened in Minneapolis, within the last month, we have had 3 young children who have been shot in the head, 2 of whom are still in the hospital fighting for their lives, one of whom that died recently, a 6-year-old girl who was coming from McDonald's with her mother. And they drove into a hail of bullets unknowingly, and a child's life was lost. And so as a mother of 4, my youngest being a 3-year-old daughter, that hits home for me. I live in the community where this happened, and I live here on purpose, in a mixed race community, but a high concentration of Black people, many of whom are low income. And so there's a lot of things that happen when people lack economic opportunity and access to resources, and our young people who are not plugged into society in the way that they should be. All of those things contribute to the stress and fire that happens in our community, which causes people to want to find a measure of safety. And unfortunately, at times the police are seen as that source of safety, even if in many ways it is an illusion of safety. And so I understand why people are fearful. They want to have someone to call. And the way that the conversation has been framed as of late, it is to basically give people a false choice between no police or corrupt, abusive police. And I think there's a lot of middle ground in between when we are looking at what is happening to Black communities across the country. And a big part of it has to do with the fact that we never have received reparations or any economic relief as a result of the institution of Jim Crow and the fact that we have been systematically denied access to opportunity and discriminated against. And so where's the recourse?
Yeah, so I want to go back, and you started by saying that you agreed somewhat with Dr. Abdullah, but you think the issue is more nuanced. And I think I agree more with you. I've known Dr. Abdullah a long time, brilliant, love her to death. I do, though, I talk to a lot of people on this show, a lot of people that live in those crime-ridden communities. And as you said, for them, people in those communities, they want safety. I was just at a girlfriend's house myself last week, consoling her, mourning with her the death of her dad. And her security guy showed up, and she's telling me that 3 Black teenagers are jumping fences, breaking into houses in her neighborhood. So I thought this was a great time to have a conversation about defund the police with her. And so she politely let me know in girlfriend talk, that I was out of my mind crazy. And I won't use the word she used, but essentially she was saying, that sounds great, Areva, you on CNN. Y'all talk about that, but I live here. So we do have to take into consideration that people that live in communities are facing real fears and real danger. And in the case of this poor little 6-year-old girl and the other 2 kids that you talked about, that our hearts go out to their families, real violence. And so we've got to think about how are we going to talk about it and move the needle on police reform in a way so that we don't have citizens like the woman leading the lawsuit against the Minneapolis Police Department is a Black woman, correct?
Yeah, there are quite a few Black people connected to that particular lawsuit. And I believe she's also running for city council against Jeremiah Ellison, who represents our ward. So I'm in the same ward where a lot of this is happening. And honestly, we have to think twice about letting our children play outside. I have a son who's almost 17. I'm concerned about him walking from our house to the park, which is right across the street. Because
so when you talk to this woman, Nakima, the woman that's leading this lawsuit, who's now running for city council, and I agree with you, this should not be a false choice between no police and corrupt police. We've got to change that narrative because that absolutely is not the choices that we're asking people to make. But in the minds of that Black woman, if you know, or those plaintiffs in that lawsuit, what is it that they want to see happen moving forward?
They want to see a restoration of the Minneapolis Police Department. There are some issues there as well in terms of that narrative that's being brought forth by some of the folks connected to the lawsuit. I mean, it's really complex when you think about it. You have folks who really don't want you to talk about the police at all, despite the fact that they have a long history of violence and abuse and being able to kill people with impunity, being able to racially profile and criminalize people. And so that to me is also problematic. There was a press conference a couple of weeks ago where one of the folks connected to the lawsuit basically said, you know, we have a lot of good police officers on the force and they're not Derek Chauvin. Now that erases the fact that there are quite a few Derek Chauvin type individuals who are on the force. And it also ignores the systemic problems with the Minneapolis Police Department and their mistreatment and abuse of the Black community here. And
so that woman who said that, her name is actually Sandra Samuels. And yes. I read that quote in the New York Times where she said, everybody's not Derek Chauvin. So Dr. Abdullah said that it's the billions of dollars, the millions of dollars in PR that's poured into cities by these police lobbies and police associations that have overpowered the message. And she even used the word manipulated. Obviously, Sandra, smart, intelligent Black woman, would take issue with anyone saying that she's been manipulated. But do you think it is messaging that is causing, you know, some folks to say we want more police? We don't think everybody's a Derek Chauvin. That's, you know, what is driving? You know, obviously there's fear. We talked about that. We talked about the violence. But is there something underneath that? Are they being, you know, manipulated or somehow swayed by these messages from these police unions?
I don't think that they're being swayed by messaging from the police unions. I mean, our former head of our police union is disgraced. You know, we basically applied pressure for him to get out of that seat early. He retired in January. He was very toxic and very racist, in my opinion. So we don't listen to the union, even, you know, the folks connected to the lawsuit. But Sandra Samuels' husband had been a Minneapolis City Council member for many years. Then he also became a school board member as well. He's no longer in either of those positions. So they are connected to government. They are connected to philanthropy. And they're connected to a lot of folks in their community who don't feel safe, because we have had an increase in crime that has happened in Minneapolis. And I literally warned Jeremiah Ellison when he started saying we were going to dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department. Again, not having Black people at the table, no hearings, no consultation from experts. They just came up with a plan and they tried to push it on the people, and they went to the white community first, you know, white liberals and white progressives, to push this message. And I told him, you're going to turn Minneapolis into the Wild Wild West. There are people who will hear that and they will prey upon people who are already vulnerable. And that's what we have seen happen, unfortunately, in our community. And it's predictable, you know, these things are happening.
So I know in November, you're going to have on your ballot this measure about replacing the police with this public safety agency. What is this? What's a public safety agency? What does it look like?
That's a good question. I mean, we did not advocate for that, for that measure. This is some members of city council. I know that Dr. Abdullah said that a lot of activists live in the community, but not a lot of them live in the communities that are most heavily impacted by some of the crime and violence. And so when we're saying Black people need a seat at the table, we're talking about the Black folks who live in these neighborhoods, to talk about, if you're saying reimagine public safety, what does that look like? I think people would be open to that. But when the groundwork hasn't been laid and people haven't been engaged in the conversation and had an opportunity for input, they're going to reject that. Why? Because they may fear the devil that they do know, but they fear the devil they don't know even more. Yeah. And that's kind of the place that we're in right now.
Yeah, I want to bring into this conversation Yannette Emanuel. She's a public policy advocate at the ACLU in Maryland, and Marian Gray Hopkins. She is the co-founder and president of the Coalition of Concerned Mothers. Good morning, Yannette, and good morning, Marian. I wanted to, welcome you to the show, and I wanted to bring you on with Nekima because the two of you are in Maryland, and you have been a part of this movement that resulted in sweeping police reform being passed in the state. And I just wanted to see if there are any, comparisons that can be made and hear from the two of you what the journey was like in Maryland and what a city like Minneapolis, a state like Minnesota, and other states around the country can learn from what happened in Maryland. So I'll start with you, Yannette. I know you work for the ACLU and you all were re-energized after the murder of George Floyd to get this legislation passed?
Thank you so much for having me. To your question, I think we made the intentional decision to center our campaign around the families that have been directly impacted by police violence, as well as other communities that have been directly impacted. So we didn't, our demands weren't new. These were issues that advocates and community members have been working on for decades. So naturally, we picked these 5 demands because these were issues that the community strongly cared about, and the support was already there. So we didn't run into those same issues where there were, except for maybe our demand to remove school resource officers from schools. That's a demand that's going to take a little bit more public education. But for the other demands, for the most part, community groups and impacted families were on board because they had been calling for these reforms for so many years.
Can you just tell us briefly what those 5 demands were?
Yes. So the first demand was repealing the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, reforming the Maryland Public Information Act to allow public disclosure over police misconduct records, returning local control to Baltimore City, and establishing a statewide, limiting police use of force statewide. And then the last one is removing police officers out of our schools.
And I'll ask you, Marion, I know you lost a son to violence some years ago. My condolences to you and the loss of your son. So you sit as a victim of a violent crime and also as a community activist. What has the process been like for you? And do you feel like your voice was heard, or did you have a seat at the table as these demands were being made? You may be on mute, Marion.
Sorry about that. Yes, first of all, I want to say thank you for this opportunity. And as Yannette has said, we have been working on this legislation for many, many, many years. I have been out since the year 2000, working on some of this legislation. I think one of the things that we have seen differently, most recently after the killing of George Floyd, the killing of Breonna Taylor, and so many more. As a matter of fact, 1,068 since George Floyd. And some of what we have seen is that the diversity of the people it has been huge. And we have been able to mobilize more folks and organize more. And I think the organizing of the people has allowed us to get more traction this legislative session than we have ever had before.
And so when you listen to what Kima is saying is happening locally in Minneapolis, what do you think some of the lessons that you all learned that could be applied to the activists that are working in Minneapolis towards change?
I think one of the biggest things is the education. I think people are being misled by in some cases, media, by the information that the police unions are getting out there. And so our fight is to make sure that we're educating people so that they understand exactly what's going on and not listen to the propaganda, if you will.
So Yannette, you mentioned the 5 demands that were made. I didn't hear any demand around defunding or reducing your police budget. Was that not a part of one of the changes or some of the changes that you all wanted to see in Maryland?
For our coalition, we really focused on trying to transfer power into the community. So we wanted to establish civilian oversight boards that had powers to actually investigate with subpoena powers and actually impose discipline that sticks. We wanted to repeal the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights because it was a huge barrier to creating these civilian oversight boards with real powers, and just gave officers special rights that no other government or public employee has in disciplinary proceedings. So we really focused on how do we change the core issues to having that transparency and accountability, and those are where we exerted and focused all our energy on.
So I hear you.
Areva, if you don't mind, if I could just for just a second here. I think one of the things that we did would kind of look at defunding would be the school resource officers. There's a $10 million budget. And we were looking to, if they removed the school resource officers, that 10 million could be reallocated back into resources that would improve schools.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you were thinking in terms of defunding specifically as it related to schools, not the police that, can police our communities.
Yeah, well, that was just one component where we looked at defunding. But
Okay.
yes, as Yannette has mentioned, we put our focus on the other priorities.
So Nikema, I'll ask you, in Minneapolis, has that been the focus in terms of returning control or giving more control to local citizens through oversight boards, through these civilian oversight committees? Has that been on the table for Minneapolis, versus the bigger step of defunding?
Yes, it's been on the table for many years. There's an organization called Twin Cities Coalition for Justice for Jamar that was formed in the aftermath of 24-year-old Jamar Clark being killed in 2015. They have a whole mission around community control of the police. And they're one of the groups that we work with on a regular basis. And they have a measure that they are trying to get on the ballot as well. It may not make the cut this year, but they're going to try again until it actually gets on the ballot they want total control of the Minneapolis Police Department in the hands of the people, an elected board of individuals who help make the decisions around the police and disciplinary measures and things like that. But I think the bigger issue, so I've known Marion for a while as well, and she's traveled to Minneapolis, and her son was killed as a result of police violence, from my understanding. Versus, like community violence. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that I think has happened here is that sometimes we get a lot of messaging from the outside. So even with that measure that has made it onto the ballot, there were hundreds of thousands of dollars in philanthropic money that came from outside of the state to allow that coalition to be built up, to get that measure on the ballot. And so people a lot of times reject and resist when messages are coming from the outside and they're not built up from within. In terms of the education that Yannette and Marion talked about that happened in Maryland, where you're trying to bring the people along, not force, something down their throats that maybe they haven't even had time to process. And so
what we did hear Marion say, Nikema, is that this coalition that they were able to put together was incredibly diverse. I was reading an article, I think it was in the New York Times, one of the major publications, that talked about how divided Minneapolis is, that after George Floyd's death, that there is more division, this article suggested, than even before on issues like police reform. Some folks even saying that the trial of Derek Chauvin wasn't fair, that he was treated unfairly, and folks believing that the police reform movement has gone way too far. So how do you start to bring that coalition together when people seem to have taken very strident and opposite positions, and they seem to be pretty entrenched?
Well, before George Floyd was killed, we tried to let the world know that Minnesota and Minneapolis is the Jim Crow North. So I'm not surprised when you have people who don't want to see a cop tried, who don't want to see change regarding police reform and transformation. They have been there. They have attacked us every step of the way when we have tried to push for these changes. So I don't even worry about them. I'm focused on, as an activist, who is ready for some type of change and an honest conversation about where do we go from here and how do we move people along. But you also have other groups that have maybe a completely different analysis or agenda. But all of this was in place before George Floyd was killed. I think it's now maybe magnified more. And the actions of some members of city council and some of the activist groups who hadn't been boots on the ground doing the work in trying to push forward the initiatives that the Black community didn't sign up for is evidence of what we were talking about before George Floyd was killed.
Right.
Right.
So, Marion, one of the earlier guests, Dr. Abdullah, talked about how police unions and police associations, in her opinion, were co-opting the message and talking directly to victims, crime victims like yourself, and causing those crime victims to become aligned with these police unions. Do you think that's happening? I mean, you are, that person, you're in that category of people that she is describing. Is that your experience?
That has not been my experience, but I'm sure it's out there. People have their own personal agendas, and for whatever, they are sellouts, they're bought out, however you want to term it. But they are. But I will tell you that if it's an impacted family, generally, we are focused on whatever it is that can change, that needs to be changed in order to continue to save lives. We don't talk about justice. If there was a preventative measure out there, and that our loved ones were never killed. So I think when they're talking about, they're talking about those that say they're allies, but really they're not, and can be bought out.
Mhm. But the other question we've been talking about this morning is the Black community. And obviously, we're not a monolithic community. You know, we all have our own views, our own opinions. We are different socioeconomic classes. We live in different communities. But Nakima said in Minneapolis when they started this, you know, talking about defunding the police, Black people who live in impacted communities were not at the table. Has that been your experience in the work that you've done in Maryland? Do you feel like Black people who live in, you know, high crime impacted communities, have they been at the table? Are these the demands that you guys put forth, those 5 demands? Are those, you know, does that speak to the issues that are important to people in impacted communities?
I would say yes. I would say we have not been at the table in the past. I think we're fighting to be more at the table, and that's what it's going to require if we're going to see the change that's needed. That you have to have the voices of those that have been impacted at the table. We do experience where people say, no, we need more officers on the street. You know, we're killing each other. And there's not as many police killings as there are killings of Black people by each other. And so we continue to hear that, but it's about educating people about what the differences are and understanding that both are equally as important and they don't go together, that we have to keep them separate.
Yeah. No,
and if I could just add,
it is important. Go ahead, jump in.
I was just going to add to that our office has an intake line where we get a lot of these complaints, and we engage with a lot of these families. So when we were also reviewing these demands, we were meeting with families and going through their cases and figuring out how what happened to their families relates to the demands that we're advocating for. So they were involved in those conversations, and that was something that we were absolutely deliberate about.
Yeah, and I do thank you for sharing that, Jeanette, and Marion, thank you for making that point. And let's all be very clear, everyone on this show today, we all care about Black on Black violence as much, if not more, as we care about police violence. And there is a clear difference. One, we're talking about state-sanctioned violence, people who are acting under the color of law, who are trained professionals whose job is to protect and serve in communities, who are abusing the power that is given to them by the badge that they wear. That's a very different kind of crime than the violence that happens in Black communities. And for those folks that say, we don't march, we don't shout, we don't get upset, you're categorically wrong. No doubt about it. Anybody that's been impacted by violence in our communities, and that would be probably everybody sitting here in this interview, me included, our hearts ache for anyone, my cousin, the 6-year-old, your son, anybody that's killed by violence is, a stain against our society and against our community. So we are equally concerned. When we talk about investing resources, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about breaking the cycle of that violence by investing in our community. So I just think that's so important that we continue to state that, because that message gets muddled, particularly by those that would seek to divide us. Nakima, I do want to ask you, before I let you go, what's next? I mean, we got divided Minneapolis, we got crime rates increasing, we got a 6-year-old baby that's been killed. We've got Sandra Samuels and suing other plaintiffs, suing the city of Minneapolis. Where do you see, the movement, the protest movement, the activist movement going in Minneapolis this, 1 year after Floyd's death?
Well, I think, as Dr. Melina said, we're going to continue to be in the streets. I mean, there's no doubt about that. We have to continue to build upon the momentum that we have been building for the last several years by taking to the streets, by going to the halls of power, by encouraging people who care about these issues to run for office and stand their ground. And we will continue to support our community. So a lot of the activists who are out on the front lines fighting against police violence are also serving food to the community, providing books and other resources, and advocating in different arenas to help improve the quality of life for Black folks in the city of Minneapolis. So we're going to continue to do that. I think all of it is very important. And I do think that with Biden in office, we're going to have to pressure him around not only taking action on policing, but pushing for reparations for our community. Because if we had the resources that were due to our community, a lot of these issues would not even exist.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought that up because on Friday we're going to be talking more about reparations because we're going to be looking at the Tulsa massacre, Black Wall Street, and that reparations. So incredible as we look back on a year of George Floyd's murder, we can have conversations about reparations, and we won't be called fringe. We're not called those crazies on the left because now the whole conversation about reparations has become mainstream. So when we think about what has changed in this country over the last year, and obviously this was starting to change even before George Floyd, but now we're able to have that conversation with lawmakers at the highest level, including our president and vice president. Miriam, before I let you go, I know that your governor, Hogan, vetoed some of the reform bills, but because of the Democratic majority, you had power to overcome that veto. But what's next in Maryland? I mean, you've gotten these bills passed. Is there more to come in terms of police reform in your state?
Absolutely, because there are several of the bills that did not pass through. So we're going to continue, as I mentioned, to mobilize and organize. As Melina Abdullah has said, we have to stay in the streets. We have to educate the people. And yes, he vetoed the bill, but we had the power behind us. As we mentioned, we had over 90 organizations, and we had independent of those organizations, we had individuals that said, no, enough is enough. And we want to see this change, and it was overridden. So yeah, we're going to continue to fight, but I'm going to let Yannette, I guess, add on to that, because I know there's a lot of work. I've worked with the ACLU for many, many years. I'm on the board of the ACLU of Maryland, and I want to give her the opportunity to talk about all the great work that we did and all the great work that is underway.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Tell us what's coming up next for Maryland and the ACLU.
Well, we made some progress this session, but there's definitely still a lot of work to do. So I mentioned the Civilian Oversight Boards earlier. That is something that we're going to continue to push for. That is a demand that the Black and Brown community has had for decades, even predating the Civil Rights era. So this is something that we're committed to establishing in our community, as well as monitoring implementation, because that will be key. We know that there have been a bunch of police reform that has passed statewide or throughout the nation, and there's been a lot of roadblocks in implementation. So we're going to be monitoring and organizing around the implementation of these policies as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the work that all of you are doing on this issue. And I think the clarion call of staying in the streets has been made and has been well received. And I look forward to having you all back and continuing this conversation. But again, thank you so much for joining me this morning, and thanks for the work that you're doing.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
All right. Now, my next guest is a writer and journalist. His name is Jared Hill. He is the president of the National Association of Black Journalists of Los Angeles, and he's the co-host of the Fanti podcast. And joining him is Adiba Nelson. She is an IDEA activist and author, and they're both here to talk about some of the culture shifts that we've seen in the last year since the murder of George Floyd. Good morning and welcome back to the show, Jared, and good morning to you, Adiba, and welcome to the show. We've been talking a lot about police reform and what the activists have been in the streets marching and fighting for, and some of the policy changes. But I wanted to talk with both of you about kind of what's else is happening. I know, Adiba, you wrote an article saying that you can finally exhale. You said that after Biden was elected. So I want to ask you, how encouraged are you now, 1 year after George Floyd's murder? We haven't seen that federal piece of legislation passed. We know it's stalled in the Senate, but we have seen at the state level, like we just talked to the folks from Maryland, changes that have been made in many states throughout the country. So do you feel like now you can kind of exhale?
Thank you for that question. I feel a little bit. I think when the inauguration happened and we finally got over the did he win, did he not win debacle, I felt like I could finally breathe just a small sigh of relief. It felt like a small ceasefire, basically, if you will, because we had had 4 years of just a barrage of violence and state-sanctioned violence and intimidation and threats, mockery of the disabled community, a flaunting of power when it came to segregation and separatists and white supremacy. And so it finally felt like we could breathe just a little bit. I didn't have to worry as much. Do I still feel that way to an extent? Yes. But but it's kind of with bated breath, if you will. I'm still waiting to see what happens. As you said, the bill is stalled. What will happen from here? Where do we go? We have a changing of the guard, but what does that really mean? What will that actually look like? For me, it's still a little too early to fully exhale.
All right, that's fair enough. So, Jared, we've seen a sea change in art, in music, in books, and just overall in the culture. Help us understand the impact that George Floyd's death had on our culture.
I think there are myriad ways that we can look at the ways that George Floyd's murder happening in the way that it happened has had an impact in culture. And one of the things that I think about a lot is Black folks' conversation around mental health. I feel like I've heard so many Black people having conversations about the ways that we feel, the ways that we engage this kind of content, the ways that we feel at work and being able to speak up about those things. But I also know that we've seen a lot more Black folks feeling more empowered to speak up at work, to be able to talk about what they're feeling, what they're experiencing. And I think that's been a really, really important part of this conversation, because I've talked to so many Black folks that from being president of National Association of Black Journalists here in LA, to friends and colleagues in various other industries, and also in doing media trainings with major companies and things like that. Black folks feel much more empowered to say, this is a problem. This is something that I experienced. I'm not going to put up with X, Y, and Z. And I think that is also having an impact for brown folks when we think about Black and brown folks in the workplace. And I think that has been really, really valuable for people. But I think we've also seen myriad other ways like that the culture is changing when we're looking at television. I've been noting that as we look at TV right now, that everybody's doing their race episode. Everybody has something to say about diversity and inclusion. And I think there is something valuable for that, but I think we also have to recognize that this is a moment that we could turn this into a moment or into like a long-term change. And I think that's what's most important, because we've seen these moments happen before, right? We saw a rise for women's rights after Anita Hill, and then we saw things go back down. We saw that, the Me Too movement has happened, and then the things, we'll see how things kind of shake out. And I think the same things happen with civil rights and things for Black folks. So it's a moment right now where I think it's really important that we sustain it so that it can be systemic changes as opposed to just momentary.
Yeah, you're right about television shows, movies, and also books. So, Adiba, we've seen an explosion of demand for books like White Fragility and Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. So we know, and I talked to a Black bookstore right here in Los Angeles, and he said he had an absolute, banner year in 2020 in terms of people ordering hundreds, if not thousands, of copies of Black authors and people trying to learn how to be an anti-racist. We don't know if folks read the books. We know they bought them, which is a good thing. But do you, being a disability advocate, working with people who are both disabled and people of color, are you feeling a difference? Are you feeling like people maybe did read those books on how to be an anti-racist, and that people are treating you differently, treating the community differently?
So I feel like here, I live in Tucson, Arizona, and I am very blessed to have a very supportive community around me here. It's a small town in what feels like a big city. So people know the work that I do. They're very aware of how they speak around me, how they think about things. We'll have conversations. I've had people ask me questions since the whole George Floyd murder, the Derek Chauvin case, of how can I be a better ally? How can I be a better accomplice? So I feel like when it comes to the issue of race, I do feel like people are definitely thinking with a little more intention and acting with a little more intention. However, as I've said numerous times, I always feel like when it comes to disability, that is kind of the last bastion when it comes to civil rights. And when you add Black and disability, or color and disability, that's still another hump that we have to get over. So there's still work to be done. I think it's wonderful. And I love the fact that people are actively engaging and trying to learn more about how to be just a better human in terms of civil rights in regards to race. I think we now need to start incorporating how to be a better human in civil rights in regards to disability and accessibility and inclusion.
Absolutely. So much more work to be done. I want to go back though, Jared, to you in this conversation or the comment you made about TV and everyone kind of having their race series. And we've seen this explosion, I would say, of shows like them, like that is really bad or tackling housing discrimination in Los Angeles. The family, I don't know if you've watched the series, but the family moves to Compton. And they're one of the first Black families to desegregate Compton. So you have that happening in the 50s around desegregation. And then I watched the Underground Railroad, which is the series, and this is another slave series. So it's as if there is this just barrage of shows and series that are trying to tackle race. And how much do you think that is helping move forward in terms of any real change as it relates to civil rights for people with disabilities or police reform? Or do you think it's just entertainment?
I think it's a combination of both. I think that we just had Barry Jenkins on our show, at the risk of a shameless plug for the podcast, but we just had Barry Jenkins on to talk about the Underground Railroad and really asking him the question of, like, people are so tired of slave narratives, why make this decision, right? But what was really great about that conversation was there was so much thoughtfulness that went into that show, right? And I think what we're seeing right now is so many Black creators are getting the opportunity to tell more stories. And I think that one of the things that has been frustrating to me for years, and when I was an intern at CNN, I worked on Black in America 2, the second documentary. And the first thing that I really learned as a student back then was we are so starved for images of ourselves. Anytime that we see anything that is Black, we want to be represented in it, right? And there are so few opportunities for us to see ourselves represented. And I think what's so great about right now is so many creators that are Black, that are of color, that are disabled, that are, of all kinds of different backgrounds, are getting the opportunity to tell their stories. And it is putting less responsibility on Insecure, right, to represent all Black people, or for the Underground Railroad to tell all of the story of slavery, or for, them to be the only Black piece of horror that is Black television right now, right? I think we're getting to see so many different images of Black folks, and that is part of what I'm talking about. I really hope becomes something that is more than a moment, but is really a systemic change. And as we see all of these studios making changes and investing in diversity and inclusion in ways that can also feel performative, right? I think we also have the opportunity to really see change stick and last and have some real impact from a longer term perspective.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up about, more Black people being able to tell more Black stories. On Friday, we're actually going to be talking about the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre, and we're going to be talking with an author who's written a book about the massacre. And, they're going to be, for the first time that I can remember, or maybe ever, lots of specials going on over the weekend, commemorating this massacre. And even again, the fact that we're talking about the massacre, that, we're having these conversations, and some people are going to be asking, what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma? There was something called Black Wall Street? I mean, a lot of people don't even know that happened.
I think that's such an important point, because one of the things that is really important to think about is the ways that our history, and when I say our history, I mean specifically Black history in this country, has been taught to us. And when I say has been taught to us, I mean, hasn't been taught to us, right? Like the ways that Black history, just American Black history, hasn't really been given to us in a way that is honest or equitable or considerate or compassionate to the stories of Black people and the things that we've done here in America. But even if we look at it globally, the ways that our education system tells our stories always has a white gaze or a white slant, or as we saw in Congress this past a couple of weeks, discussing January 6th as if it were just a regular tourist event, if you didn't know. And it's like the way that is getting colored right now in the first draft of history, which we reference as journalism, like that is a problem, right? And so we have an opportunity now to tell these different stories of Black folks throughout history, whether they be fiction, historical fiction, or documentary, because how many people never even heard of Tulsa, as you were saying? How many people don't know about Move Philadelphia and the police bombing there? How many people don't know about all kinds of different things that have happened in the past that are important parts of our story?
Yeah, speaking of people that don't know, Adiba, the former president of the United States thought that he made Juneteenth famous. He thought that no one knew Juneteenth, and he somehow stumbled on it
Right. Surprise.
And, you know, in his
he did that in partner with Frederick Douglass. So.
I'm sorry, what'd you say, Jared?
He did that in partnership with Frederick Douglass, who people have just learned about, apparently. So
they work together.
Yeah. But, you know, he made a big deal out of Juneteenth as if he had somehow, you know, put it on the map because he was going to remember hold a rally on Juneteenth and he had to cancel the rally. And then all of a sudden he's like, oh, everybody's now talking about this thing called Juneteenth. I do want to ask you, Adiba, Marvin Gaye, you know, he had this iconic song, What's Going On, that was really, you know, talking to us about the cultures of, you know, around the Vietnam War and the protests that were happening. And it was such a song that resonated to this day, you know, as if he could have written it today to describe what's happening now. And we've seen so many Grammy, nominated, award-winning singers who are using music. You know, they're writing songs for demonstration. They're writing songs, you know, for the Grammys. They're writing songs even for people to, you know, to get their party on at the club. How important do you think it is in this moment where something tragic like George Floyd's murder has happened, but that we take some time to focus on what I'll call Black joy? Because for me, those songs take me, as painful as some of them are, and they're reminders of painful periods, they also bring so much joy.
So I think Black joy is an integral part of just Black mental health. You have to have it to balance out all of the trauma that we see in our daily lives on a personal level, that we see on television, that we read about in the newspapers, that comes across on social media. We have to have that balance. It is so incredibly important to take the time on a daily basis to find joy. There's something that my mother always said, you know, in addition to life is what you make it, that's what her mantra, but always count it all joy. There's joy everywhere. In every little corner of your day, there's a way to find the joy. And I try to keep that in mind because when George Floyd was murdered, it took me to a really dark place. And I'm not a person who has ever struggled with depression or mental health issues. And I found myself crying literally every day for a month, and I could not find the joy. But I'm a single mom and I'm raising a disabled child, and I have a responsibility to not only show up as her mother, but show up and teach her how to continue moving forward in a world that for Black Americans is not often filled with joy. It's not intentional for us. It's not laid out for us. So it's my responsibility as her mom to not only continue to show up as her mother, but this is how we move forward when everything is falling down. We find the joy. And, you know, I have to pay homage to my girl, Beyonce, because it's really easy to stay low in those low moments. But she says, and I'll never forget the end of Formation, always stay gracious. Best revenge is your paper. And so I try to move forward with that. I don't write as much about race and race issues as I used to because people are crazy and you get some crazy emails and threatenings of doxing, and I have a child to think about. So I don't say much. And my way of finding my joy and keeping my joy is just staying gracious, keeping my pulse on what's happening, writing about it when I feel really inspired, but making sure that joy is at the center of my daughter's life. That's her world. I need her to know what's out there, but I also need her to know that this is her safe place. This is her bubble, and we all need that.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful, and that's such a great thing. We all have to find our joy. Jared, last question for you. You represent the National Black Journalists, all the Black journalists throughout this country, and you all are playing such a critical role as we talk about those creatives who are telling their stories. What do you want to see Black journalists do going forward? As we continue to grapple with and you know, stay in the streets, as Dr. Abdullah and Nakima and my guest this morning reminded us to do. What role should Black journalists play in telling those stories?
I think the role for Black journalists is many different things. I think as Adiba talked about, like, you know, I don't write about race and politics as much anymore because of the way that it impacts me. I've had that very same experience of not doing as much coverage of Donald Trump. Excuse me. I used to cover Donald Trump every day on a daily radio show, right? But like that was also emotionally exhausting, spending 5.5 years talking about Donald Trump. Yeah. But I think there are plenty of journalists whose, you know, work is in Capitol Hill, right? And they're talking about this every single day. I think more important than the coverage, because the integrity of a journalist is something that is always, is always something that we champion. But I think that journalists taking care of themselves is the most important thing. And I feel like I bring this up all the time, but I did a piece in Self Magazine last year talking with journalists about their mental health. It was about getting through June last year, right? Because so many of us remember June as an exhausting month. And like, I was surprised by the ways that journalists that I talked to were saying, like, I don't know that I'm doing a good job of it, or I'm thinking about it a lot more than I ever have. And I'm thinking about how I can take care of myself. I'm thinking about how I take care of my family, as Adiba talked about. I'm thinking about how I take care of myself at the workplace, and all of those various different things I think are really, really important for Black journalists to be thinking about, because we know how to cover stories. We know how to have integrity. We know how to write. We know how to speak. We know how to do all of those things. And I think oftentimes we don't think about how we take care of ourselves. So I think that's probably the most important.
All right. Well, we heard it at the top of the show is stay in the streets. And then at the bottom of the show, take care of yourself. Great way to end this segment. Thank you so much, Jared. Thank you, Adiba, for joining me this morning.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks to all of my guests this morning. And thanks to you for joining me. What a powerful show. This concludes our part 2 series. We said we were going to bring you everything from looking back to looking forward as it relates to George Floyd's tragic murder. And we were going to talk about how this country has changed. And I'm just so incredibly thankful for everyone that participated in this 2-part series. As I've been talking about this morning too, Friday, it's already Wednesday. Friday, we're going to be talking about Tulsa, Oklahoma. And if you don't know what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and why we're doing a whole show on it, you can go to Google and you can come back here Friday morning and meet some of the folks that live in Tulsa now, and some of the experts that are writing about and helping to educate the world about the massacre that, again, is such an important flashpoint for African American history. Some words to live by before I get out. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. The murder of George Floyd last Memorial Day shook the country, and it shook it hard. It shined a bright spotlight on centuries-old racism and upended the status quo that so many white Americans had grown accustomed to. They were expecting it and they cherished it. That's the status quo. When that bystander video of Darnisha Frazier went viral, we may have thought that George Floyd's murder was a case about rogue policing. But in reality, what we later found out was that it was a case about decades of systemic racism and disparities that all converged that one day in front of that Cup Foods in Minneapolis, Minnesota. George Floyd's murder tells us that we need to go deeper. We need to go deeper than the criminal justice system and deeper than our healthcare system, because those systems are all related to systems of racism. And during this year, we have been talking so much about race and systemic racism. And what we now know a year later is that so many issues remain unresolved. And it is way, 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 way too mature, as Adiba said, to declare any kind of victory or to even suggest that we're close to consensus. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we are having different conversations and we are witnessing real policy shifts related to policing and the criminal justice system. And I'm asking, are these conversations and policy shifts enough to address the deeply entrenched racism that has been exposed? And the answer is clearly no. But do I have hope that we are at least at the starting line of a long and challenging marathon that can lead to real change? And the answer to that is yes. And Exhibit A of my hope is that we acknowledge on the same day, let me start that over. And Exhibit A of my hope is on the same day that we acknowledge the murder of George Floyd, we did something else that was incredibly important in this country. We confirmed Kristen Clark, a Harvard College graduate, a Columbia Law School graduate, to the position of the head of the Civil Rights Department of the Department of Justice. And she is the first Black woman ever in the history of this country to have that position. And she was confirmed by the U.S. Senate. Now, it was only one Republican that voted for her confirmation. So I'll say that ain't perfection. But the fact that she got confirmed, I'll say that's damn good. I'm out, y'all. Be safe out there. Remember, we are all in this together.